Kevin. We've got you here today on the Other Side of Truth podcast, more or less to talk about two particular subjects that you don't really seem to get an opportunity to talk about a whole lot whenever I hear you do media appearances. It's usually Roswell or crash flying saucers, and that's great. But you've actually done an extensive amount of research into cattle mutilations, let's call them animal mutilations, and also alien abductions, where you sort of literally wrote the book, The Abduction Enigma, with William Cohn and Russ Estes, right?
Absolutely.
All right, well, I'm flipping a coin here as we speak, and because it seems to be a popular topic of conversation these days, let's start with the so-called alien abduction phenomenon. And perhaps you can tell us in general what your view of it is and what was the point that you were trying to make in your book, The Abduction Enigma. And then we can go from there.
My opinion is alien abduction is all terrestrially based. There's no extraterrestrial component to it, other than what the UFO researchers have attempted to inject into it. The purpose of the book, The Abduction Enigma, was to explain that in great detail and let everybody see the parallels in other arenas. And by parallels, I mean take a look at the satanic ritual abuse. Same sort of phenomenon, people suppressing the memories and then coming back with the memories years later, much of it induced under hypnotic regression, much of it induced by researchers or therapists, kind of implanting ideas into people's minds. So we looked at all of that. We looked at the research being done, and we said, these people, the researchers, are leading the abductees into the areas they want them to go. The best example of that is John Mack, who had said repeatedly in a number of arenas, we actually have it on videotape, and it's in the book by Bryant on the Massachusetts or the MIT abduction conference, that he found it odd that the abductees were sort of drawn to the specific researcher that had a specific kind of abduction in mind. Bud Hopkins had the cold calculating aliens. David Jacobs had the aliens who were creating hybrids. John Mack had aliens with an Eastern philosophy, and he found that this kind of matching with abductee with researchers to be kind of strange. And we kind of flipped that around and said, maybe it's that these people come without a specific kind of abduction, and they're subtly coached into the point of view of the specific researcher, which made perfect sense to us, but apparently not to John Mack, who said, well, I never said anything like that. But of course he did. So we looked at the abductions. We found terrestrially based explanations. One of the things we found was that sleep paralysis does in fact account for some alien abductions. But by means not all of them, but some of them. And yet the abduction researchers will say, well, people were awake when they had their abduction, so sleep paralysis doesn't work. Well, we didn't say it worked for all of them, but there is a phenomenon called cataplexy, which is basically sleep paralysis when you're wide awake, but it's always associated with narcolepsy. So our question is, has anybody checked the abduction population to see if there is a disproportionate number of narcoleptics in the abduction population, which also led to other abnormalities that we observed. Mark Roderiger said that in his research he found more left-handed people than you would expect. We found people, an overrepresentation of homosexuals in the abduction population, which of course immediately opened up to criticism being homophobic. And all we said was we were making an observation that given the number of homosexuals in the general population, you would expect that to be reflected in abductees if they are randomly picked. We didn't find that. We found a larger number of abductees than you would expect. This is an abnormality in the statistics, not necessarily the lifestyle of the person, but the statistics. And it made us think, well, what other sorts of things might you find if you check the abductee population? Is there a preponderance of college-educated people? Democrats over Republicans?
Star Wars fans versus Star Trek fans.
I was thinking of blood types, a preponderance of one blood type that doesn't match the general population. It might give us a clue about something that was going on, but of course, that's overlooked, and instead they say, well, you said they're all homosexuals, and that's just being homophobic. But what we were trying to point out, here are some things that we found with what we thought was a fairly dispassionate investigation of the abduction phenomenon, something that needed to be researched, and yet hadn't been done so, because The researchers didn't think that was appropriate questions to be asked. The other thing we suggested was that abduction research had been mostly case studies, which is you talk to the person, you get their history, you do that sort of thing. Nothing beyond that. So 20 years after the first abduction or 30 years after the first abduction, they're still doing case studies. Here we are 14, 15 years after the book is published, they're still doing the case studies. They haven't advanced the methodology at all. We've got a phenomenon that just is sort of taking a great deal of energy from the UFO phenomenon, and I think just wasting it on the abduction research. Rather than trying to advance the research, okay, we understand the case studies. We got that. What can we do now to advance that? Let's maybe develop a protocol that would separate sleep paralysis from alien abduction, because the symptoms for both are exactly the same. We need to develop a protocol so we can say this was sleep paralysis, this was something else. Hasn't been done yet.
But to do that, Kevin, wouldn't allow people like Bud Hopkins to claim thousands or even perhaps millions, if they extrapolate the way I've heard some people do it, of Americans who are being abducted by aliens from Zeta Reticuli.
Let me just talk about the extrapolation of the numbers.
Sure.
Because this was based on a study that was done at the request of Robert Bigelow, and they commissioned a study. They had 5 questions that would suggest the person was a legitimate abductee. When they completed their survey, they found that basically the number of abductees in the population was 0, given the plus or minus on the poll. So they changed the parameters and said it's for the 5 questions, and based on that survey, they now extrapolated the 3 to 6 million people, American people, being abducted. But they invalidated their results by changing the parameters of the study after it had been completed, and they didn't get the results they wanted.
Well, that doesn't sound very scientific.
No, it doesn't. And a subsequent poll done found basically the same thing, that the margin of error fell inside 0. I mean, you could say basically nobody's abducted. So they didn't do that, and they reject the idea of sleep paralysis explaining any abductions without even looking at it. They say, well, people, as I said, the people were wide awake. Well, you haven't explained sleep paralysis, and you haven't eliminated it as a causal factor in some cases of alien abduction, which you must do.
The key word in that entire sentence you just said there is some cases of alien abduction. So,
absolutely.
And what I often hear from, I'll call them believers, actually, you know what I'll call them, what I've called them in print, the alien abduction cult. When they're presented with sleep paralysis at all, they'll say, well, you're trying to explain this as sleep paralysis, and it's not sleep paralysis. They never talk about whether sleep paralysis can explain some cases. They just say, look, sleep paralysis doesn't explain all cases, and the implication that they usually leave you with is, well, it really doesn't explain any of them.
No, every case of alien abduction is a case of alien abduction, regardless of what it is. And I think one of the important cases is the Pat Roach abduction from Lehi, Utah, which I investigated in the mid-1970s. It was one of the first cases to get into the mainstream, but it is the very first case in which they talked about, or the witness talked about the aliens coming into the house and things like that. But what struck me is I said at the time, unless we come up with a psychological phenomenon to explain this, well, then we have a very mysterious case. Years later, people started talking about sleep paralysis, and I said, that explains this case completely. Pat Roach talked about being asleep on the couch and awaking with something in the room, and she didn't remember much about it. But 2 years later, after she read magazine articles about alien abduction, she decided that's what had happened to her. And that's where we went with this thing. But I'm sure the Pat Roach abduction case is now explainable to sleep paralysis.
Well, what about then, because that's a case of one person alone in their house, in the living room, at night. So sure, check, explain with sleep paralysis. But what about the most classic case of all, I guess, the Betty and Barney Hill case? 2 people driving in a car. I would think that would be pretty hard to explain away sleep paralysis unless they both have it at the same time. So what's the explanation for the Betty and Barney Hill case? Because that's usually the one that most people point to as the best. Even Carl Flock thought that something very strange happened to the Hills. And he actually told me that he thought it was a legitimate alien abduction case. I think it was the only one he actually thought was legitimate, but he thought the Hill case was was legitimate. And Carl, was no pro-alien abduction guy. So what's the explanation for the Hill case then?
If I was going to point to a case that was probably alien abduction, that would be it, because it makes sense that it would operate that way. But when you begin to look at the evidence for the case and how it was conducted, you've got the two people driving alone on the highway. They think they spot a UFO. They become more and more frightened by this UFO. They keep stopping to look at it. They keep stopping to study it. They eventually come home. It's later than they expected to get home, but of course it is. But remember, nothing consciously about this. And Betty Hill has dreams about being abducted. Betty Hill had been interested in UFOs for a long time. She actually had written to Don Kehoe at NICAP and suggested he put under hypnotic regression to see if there was anything there. The researchers who started on the case thought she had been abducted, and there was a great deal of interaction between Betty Hill and the abduction researchers, with Barney sitting there listening to the case. But the whole thing sort of developed out of Betty Hill's dreams. Under the hypnotic regression done by Dr. Benjamin Simon, he was of the opinion that it was all something that had been invented as a dream. So there is an explanation there. It's not sleep paralysis. It's a different thing, and it's a belief structure kind of directing where your opinions are going to go, which is not to say this is an explanation for the Barney and Betty Hill case, but it seems to me that when you look at this case and you understand, in fact, there was one point where everybody said Barney's drawing of the aliens looks like the aliens from the Oblero Shield, which is an Outer Limits episode. And they said, well, we never watched those sorts of programs. And I'm thinking, that doesn't fly with me, because you only have to watch one. It may not be something you regularly watch, but they missed the real point. Betty Hill, in the text of this, and when they're discussing this supposed remembered event, she says to Barney, have you been watching The Twilight Zone? And there's a Twilight Zone episode called Hocus Pocus and Frisbee, and it's Andy Devine as the world's greatest liar. I mean, everything, he was involved in everything. He invented everything. He was the smartest man in the world. And the aliens came from space, and they wanted to get the smartest guy in the world, and they abduct him onto their spacecraft, and he escapes from them by playing his harmonica. And they look human until Andy Devine punches one in the face, and the plastic mask falls away, and they look a great deal like the Barney Hill alien. So you have an abduction played out prior to the Hills talking about the abductions on the Twilight Zone. And so the information was there. Bud Hopkins was fond of saying there are no traditional sci-fi gods and demons for the abductees to model their cases after. And the answer is yes, there are. The Twilight Zone, for one. There's a really crummy movie called Killers from Space, which is an alien abduction, with the big-eyed aliens and he being abducted out of an airplane, but just before it crashes, he has no conscious memories of this thing until he undergoes a chemical regression. So it's all laid out there. So the Barney and Betty Hill case didn't sort of appear in a vacuum where there was nothing from science fiction or pop culture or the world around them to draw upon. And well, Betty Hill says, well, we didn't really watch The Twilight Zone. That doesn't mean they didn't watch it once. They didn't watch it twice. They didn't see a preview. They didn't see something about it because she knew what it was about. So this stuff is sort of percolating through our collective consciousness, if you will, and everybody knows what's going on. So the Barney and Betty Hill case isn't as strong as the abduction researchers would make it to be. And the other thing about the case is they say, well, they've got the star map. And how could Betty Hill dream up the star map if it's not real? The problem is the person who found the pattern in the star map, Marjorie Fish, based her research on the idea that the red dwarf stars were unimportant. So she left them out of her models as she was trying to find the pattern. And it turns out in the latest astronomy magazines, they talk about the importance of the dwarf stars. So her model was not representative of our section of the galaxy. It's got to be revisited. And besides that, there's at least 4 interpretations of the Betty Hill star map from other people, including one from Betty Hill herself that does not match the Marjorie Fish model. So there's all kinds of problems with the Barney and Betty Hill case that the abduction researchers and the UFO fans rarely talk about.
The first time I heard Carl Sagan talk about the Hill case, and talk about the star map, I was convinced that whatever you think of the Hill case, the star map is not something that I would be putting forward as a determinative piece of evidence, because Sagan made it pretty clear that it could mean a lot of things. If you just look at it this way, or if you had done this, then that so-called map can represent a whole bunch of different conclusions, not just the one that Marjorie Fish and Stan Friedman and others have for many years pointed to. The other thing that I'll mention is you do realize that you dropped Andy Devine's name in the context of a UFO conversation. Where did Andy Devine grow up? Kingman, Arizona, which of course is one of the more famous alleged UFO crashes that appears in your book, Crash When UFOs Fall from the Sky.
When I drove through Kingman, Arizona, when I was in Kingman, Arizona, I actually drove down Andy Devine Drive or Andy Devine Street or Boulevard or whatever it is.
Boulevard, yeah. And if you go down I've been to Kingman many times. If you go down Andy Devine Boulevard, there's two things there. One, there's a really great diner, Mr. DZ's Diner. I love it. And two, the turnoff to old Route 66 that drives up through the mountains, then down to Oatman, begins just off Andy Devine Boulevard. So, great piece of Americana. And if you've never driven on Route 66 down through Oatman, you should. Because you can actually go to I don't know if you knew this, but you can actually go to the hotel where Clark Gable, I think it was Carol Lombard, spent their honeymoon, their first evening of wedded bliss.
I did not know that.
That's true, and it's a really small hotel. So all these sort of little interesting things. The UFO thing is part of that broader cultural mosaic, whatever else it is. So there you go, an Andy Devine reference and the Kingman UFO crash.
To interrupt just one more time, of course, after the book was published, I got a phone call from Judy Wolcott's daughter. Judy Wolcott was one of the people that said her husband had been in the tower when the thing crashed, and then he had been sent to Vietnam, sent her a letter about the UFO crash, but just mentioned some details, and he said, I'll tell you more when I got home, and then he was killed in Vietnam. And so this sort of cemented the idea that there was a crash in Kingman because that added corroboration to the other tale of the Kingman crash. But it turns out, according to Judy Wolcott's daughter, her father wasn't killed in Vietnam. In fact, died in 2006. He would have been 15 when the Kingman crash took place and wouldn't have been in the control tower at the time. And so we've now erased that bit of corroboration for the Kingman crash. The other fellow, Arthur Stansel, who originated the Kingman crash, you might say, mentioned that he tended to embellish his stories when he drank a little bit, and the two teenage boys who first interviewed him about this, or talked to him about UFOs and got the story from him first, Young and Chudham, he said he'd only had 4 beers before he talked to them. So the credibility of the case has just gone down the tubes.
I want to go back to alien abductions and just ask you, because you were on the Paracast a little while ago with Gene Steinberg and Chris O'Brien, and the guests were Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs. Now, I listened to the episode. I wasn't actually on the episode because neither Jacobs or Hopkins would appear on the show with me. They threatened to walk unless I was not on the show. Gene was actually going to pull the show. He wasn't going to do it. And I said, you know what, I think it's important to get them on the record, so I'll step back. That's fine. Because I know that they were aware that I had said some not flattering things about abduction, quote, quote, research. But talk to me in particular about the work of Jacobs and Hopkins as you describe it in your book. Because you guys, there was a brief talk about the Emma Woods case at the beginning of that show, and then really it was, you didn't have an awful lot of input. And when you did speak, they tended to ignore you or just brush it off. So now I'm just going to let you go. Talk about hypnosis and the research that they've done, what's wrong with it. And one thing that I would like you to address is how much damage do you think people like Hopkins and Jacobs and even John Mack have been doing to people that might actually have some real psychological problems, but they're not getting help for those problems because they've been steered down this alien abduction path?
The problem is, I don't think they understand that hypnotic regression is not a good investigative tool. It is very easy to lead a subject in the direction you want him or her to go in the altered state of hypnosis. Bud Hopkins, in one of his books, was talking to a fellow, I think he used the name Osborne for him, a pseudonym, and how he had experienced waking up in the middle of the night with something in the room, and it very, very much frightened him. And after seeing something about alien abductions on television, contacted Hopkins. And Hopkins put him under hypnotic regression, and the transcripts are in the book. So you can see this. And Osborne's talking about well, he doesn't really see anything. Nothing's really going on. And Hopkins is pushing him for more information. And he says, well, I see something, but I don't think it's really true. And Hopkins says, well, what do you see? What do you see? And the point is, under hypnotic regression, there's a phenomenon known as pleasing the operator. In other words, the person under the hypnotic spell wants to please the person who put him into that. And it's very easy to lead them down the road. A good example is this. You put somebody under the hypnotic regression, and they say, well, I don't really remember anything. And they said, well, that's a block by the aliens. We need to put you deeper and deeper, get you down that. And they have all kinds of tricks to break the block and get through it. But all they're really doing is telling the person there's something there. You should remember it. And they eventually come up with it. What's interesting, though, is Hopkins gets cold calculating aliens. David Jacobs had a woman come to him who felt that she'd had a positive abduction experience and was pleased with it, thought it was a good thing. And after hypnotic regression from them, she realized what a frightening experience it really was. And I'm thinking, isn't that really Jacobs implanting his belief structure on this woman, given what she thought when she arrived? And so we have those sorts of things going on. But they talk about hypnotic regression as the best investigative tool they have in their arsenal, and it's a way to get at the information. I think what they're doing is subtly implanting the information on those subjects and getting them to go into the direction they want, which gets us back to Mac's statement about a matching of the abductees and the researchers. It's clear what's happening is you're getting the researchers implanting the ideas subtly and maybe not even realizing what they're doing in the subjects of alien abduction. So we've got that going on. Now, the other thing, if you study psychology, what you find out, you can either be a therapist or you can be a researcher. You cannot be both. And what do you do when you get somebody who is clearly in distress, psychological distress, and you want to do your abduction research? You continue the research, or you become a therapist for that person. And you can't do both things well. If you try to do both, you do them both poorly. You have to decide what you're going to do. And I think that what we see in some cases is an isolation of the abductee from the population. You can see cases where they were active, happy, productive members of society, and after the abduction research, they become more outcasts. One woman who had been in graduate school quit graduate school because of her abduction experiences, and so you've begun to isolate them in the population. Mac was always fond of saying, this is not a club that anybody would want to join, and our response to that was, yes, it is, because what happens if you become an abductee? Well, suddenly you're the center of attention. Suddenly people are seeking you out to get your story. You have opportunities to go on national television, opportunities you'd never had before. You have opportunities to produce books, be mentioned in magazine articles. The spotlight is a very powerful draw. So yes, there's people that want to join that club because of the benefits of being an abductee. And so I think we're setting up some people in this abductee framework where they've now structured their life around it to the exclusion of all the other positive things that may be going on in their life. And I think that's a very destructive thing to do. And I'm not sure that the abduction researchers realize what they've been doing. And Mac should have, based on his training as a psychiatrist. I mean, he should be able to recognize these things, but he was so enamored with the idea of the alien abduction that he seemed to reverse his psychological training. What we compare to in the Abduction Enigma, there's a long chapter on satanic ritual abuse. And the parallels between that and alien abduction. And in fact, two women went to a California therapist who believed they had been victims of satanic ritual abuse, and he convinced them, no, it was really alien abduction that has victimized you. So here's another great example of the researcher impressing his belief structure on his clients to the exclusion of any benefit they may have had. There's another woman, Edith Fiore, who was doing some hypnotic regression, and the subject said, I don't remember anything, and she snapped, well, then make it up. What kind of research is being conducted there? So you've got people who may have had an episode of sleep paralysis, and if they got to the right researcher and they were frightened by this experience, and he said, well, that's a common response to sleep paralysis, this fright, But you have to understand that it's a psychological thing that happens briefly on the very twilights of consciousness between sleep and wakefulness, either on going to sleep or on just waking from sleep. And it's a momentary thing, and the paralysis is normally broken within seconds. It's just a movement of a finger or something like that breaks the paralysis. But if you've got somebody, that's what they've experienced, and that's all they've experienced, and they suddenly end up at an abduction researcher, and he or she is beginning to draw out these long, involved stories of abduction and examination on the craft and that sort of thing, you haven't helped that person at all. You've taken them in a direction that was unnecessary, where you could have said to them, it's sleep paralysis, don't worry about it. It probably won't happen again. If it does, it's just momentary. Have a good life. They've now drawn this into this subculture of alien abduction, which sometimes is very destructive.
What does all this say about, I hesitate to use the term ufology. I've never liked that term. But as a shorthand, I'll use it here. Ufology, or the so-called UFO research community. What does it say about them that if you were to do a statistical analysis of the last 20 years of UFO conferences held by various organizations, books published, all that sort of stuff, the alien abduction thing has been at the forefront for the last 20 or 30 years. And very few people within UFO research really had anything negative to say about the alien abduction stuff. Bud Hopkins, David Jacobs, John Mack were held out as quality, competent researchers doing good work, something very important, and it was evidence of the extraterrestrial presence here on Earth. And I'm not just talking about sort of wackos on the fringe. I'm talking about serious researchers who would support these guys. Whereas your book, The Abduction Enigma, and a few other people who raised serious concerns about all of this, I won't say were ignored, but certainly didn't get the attention. I didn't see you getting invited to conference after conference to talk about the problems with alien abduction research and to sell your book. So what does that say about the blinders that the UFO research community put on, maybe still puts on, when it comes to trying to find things that back up the narrative of the extraterrestrial visitation?
I think when you look at UFO research community, what you're looking at are people who like to be in the spotlight, and I'm among them, but they tend to embrace everything, no matter how ridiculous it is. And it's because in the UFO research community, if you do not embrace everything, you don't get invited to the conferences. You don't get to go on the free trips and get paid to do it and sell your books. For a while there, I thought, well, I'm not going to say anything negative about any of the research. I'll just dodge the questions, but I'm not going to embrace stuff I don't believe in. And I decided, no, I don't want to do that either. I'm going to tell them what I believe to be the truth, whether they like it or not. And that's kind of where I've come from. But you can see some members of the research community embracing everything. And then there's some people who just believe it all, sincerely believe it all. The powers of discrimination, I guess, aren't that great in looking at some of the preposterous stories being told. I was stunned at the MUFON conference in Denver this last year with one guy. I was talking to a former military officer whom I thought would have good powers of discrimination, being a former military officer, and he was just buying everything. He just thought it was all true. Everything's true. Couldn't say, well, this doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But the problem is some of the researchers like the attention they get at the top of the UFO field. They want to get invited to the conferences, and they're invited to lots of them, and they buy everything. I get invited to few conferences, and I'm not sure I'm going to go to many more, but it's important to me to tell the truth. And I always have people come up to me and say, well, we're really glad that you'll help us understand what's going on. And yet those people are in the minority. Most of the people in the UFO field want to believe everything. They want to believe alien abductions. They want to believe cattle mutilations. They want to believe crop circles. They want to believe flying saucers are falling out of the sky and crashing all over the world. They want to believe everything. Military abductions, the most preposterous thing I've ever heard. Our military, supposedly, and when I say our, I mean the American military, is abducting people to see what they know about alien abductions, which is just absolutely preposterous. The problem simply is, if you want to get invited to the conferences, you must embrace everything. If you don't care about that sort of thing, then you're freer to express a negative opinion, I guess.
It's one of the strangest things that I've ever seen sort of within the sociology of ufology is there are some people who can agree to disagree. Now, obviously, I disagree with you about certain things. Roswell would be one of them. But that's all right. I respect the work that you've done. And I think I disagree with Nick Redfern about many things, too, including his conclusions on Roswell. Reasonable people can disagree. And yet, that's not the modus operandi within much of ufology. And I think it's because there's so many people who are so vested in wanting to believe, as you put it, and all these inconvenient facts, say with alien abductions, for instance, that pop up, and people just ignore them, and they don't want to talk about them. And that makes it very difficult to get anybody outside ufology to look seriously at that residue of cases that I do think are interesting and compelling, the UFO community and say this is evidence of extraterrestrial visitation. Linda Moulton Howe isn't the only one. So is it evidence of extraterrestrial visitation, Kevin, or is it just another example of the will to believe run amok when faced with inconvenient facts?
Well, let's go back to the very beginning of animal mutilations in the mid-1970s. When I first got involved in it, Jim Lorenzen, who was the international director of the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, called me one night and said, there's some bizarre animal mutilations going on in Minnesota. Would you go look into it? I said, sure, why not? He also called a number of other of their field investigators to look into the mutilations in other areas. So it wasn't just me going up to Minnesota. It was other investigators in other arenas going up there. We got up there to look at the strangeness of it. We were told that there was animal mutilations and there were circles melted in the snow near where the animals had been mutilated. There were strange holes in the ice. There were all kinds of lights in the sky seen associated with this, which made it sound like there were UFOs involved. Well, we got up there, and I say we, it was Robert Cornett and I, got up there and we found out that the circles melted in the snow were actually the result of silage piles, which were decaying, so they were giving off heat and melted the snow on them. So it wasn't exactly an alien landing case. The strange holes found in the ice had actually been chopped in the ice by the farmer so he could get his cows to water. The other strange cases all seemed to break down in similar ways. We talked to ranchers, we talked to farmers, we talked to police, we talked to radio reporters. We talked to everybody we could find, and every time we got close to something, we discovered a rational explanation for it. So when we got back home, I called Jim Lorenzen and said we didn't find anything that suggests alien intervention, and yet all around us the information was going on that there was all these strange mutilations happening. If you take a look at the mutilations, you find out that the areas they suggest as classic mutilations are the very areas that scavengers attack on a dead animal, the soft tissues. So you'd expect some kind of damage there to an animal that had died. They don't understand, a lot of the researchers don't understand the processes of death. So that what happens to the body after it dies? They say, well, there's no blood in the carcass, not realizing that when the heart stops beating, the blood all settles to the lower extremities, and then it tends to dry up, and it's not recognizable as blood. There was one case, and I was watching the Paranormal Fact or Fiction the other day on the Sci-Fi Channel. They were out in Colorado, and they said, here's this dead cow, and here's the mutilation, no sign of predators. And I said, for God's sakes, there's bird droppings on the animal. Clearly there were scavengers there. There were birds that pecked at the skin. You can see the evidence, but they didn't see that evidence. The cattle mutilations are similar to the windshield pitting that went on in Washington State in the 1950s. Here's the parallel. Here's what I'm saying. Back in the 1950s, early 1950s, a story came out that the atomic blasts, the atomic testing, was creating fallout, and that fallout would fall on the cars at night and would pit the windshields. And people would go out and look at their windshields and say, oh my God, there's pitting in my windshield. Never realizing that the pitting had been there all along, but you tend to look through your windshield, not at it. And they'd never noticed it before. And I think you've got a similar situation going on with the cattle mutilation, where an animal death that you would have ignored before even though the classic mutilations were there, now suddenly you're looking at it in a different point of view and saying, oh my God, aliens have done it. What is the purpose of it? What are they trying to learn? Chris O'Brien, on UFO Updates, somebody had asked, what are some books to read about cattle mutilation? And there was a whole list of the pro-cattle mutilation books. I just put up on Updates, you might also want to look at Mute Evidence by Kagan and Summer, and you might want to look at the Ken Rommel report that was done for the state of New Mexico. Ken Rommel being a retired FBI agent who looked at the cattle mutilation. You might want to look at these two documents to kind of balance things out. Well, I get there's this long email from Chris O'Brien about, well, how do you explain this? How do you explain that? And one of the things he said, how do you explain the lack of copper in the blood of the animals? And I thought, there's a fine question. How do you explain that? Well, in today's world, you can go on the internet and you can look up practically anything. So I typed in copper deficiency in cattle and came up with a number of scientific papers. And I discovered that the one case he was referring to was a mutilation case from Utah. And so I looked at that thing in depth and discovered that, A, it wasn't a lack of copper in the blood, but a deficiency of copper in the blood. I discovered that copper deficiency in cattle can come about if the animal is pregnant, if the feed is using is inadequate. All kinds of things cause a copper deficiency. And to get a representative sample of animals, you need to check the blood in 10 animals in the herd to see if there's a copper deficiency throughout the herd. They'd only done 6 animals, but they found the copper deficiency in another animal. So the explanation was there. What was the copper deficiency? It was completely explainable. And so that was my answer. Well, it's explainable. But that's the sort of thing that a lot of researchers don't do. He said, how do you explain the copper deficiency? Good question. I'll see. I'll see if I can find out how you explain it. And found a rational terrestrial explanation. So all the things that they've said about the cattle mutilations are explainable in the terrestrial. On that paranormal show, they did an experiment, which I didn't think was very good. They had a chamois, which is basically calf skin, and they put a rubber bladder underneath it, fastened it down all around, and then inflated the bladder to see how the chamois would split. And it split in a very straight line, like a surgical cut. After an animal's died and the body begins to bloat, you get that same sort of inflation, and it causes the skin to split in the same way. So there's all kinds of very good scientific rational explanations for this stuff, but the mutologists, as they call themselves, they're talking about something strange. But when those who are disinterested, as opposed to uninterested, disinterested, and Ken Rommel would be among the disinterested. He was paid to look into cattle mutilations. He didn't care which direction it went. He just wanted to know what was going on. He found nothing to suggest aliens were involved, and the mutologist said, well, there were no classic mutilations during his investigation. Well, there's a convenient out. Summers and Kagan traveled around the country. They had a lot of money from, I think it was Bantam Books, to investigate cattle mutilations. And they discovered rational terrestrial explanations for everything. And, of course, their book didn't become a bestseller because they weren't perpetuating the mystery. So
no, and I point out in my film, Fields of Fear, but also I pointed out in my blog over the years, there's an article that I can't bring myself to call them mutologists. No crazy whack-out believe that aliens are mutating cows alleged researcher will ever reference. And usually you'll hear them say, well, veterinarians, the scientific establishment never takes a look at this. If only they would. Well, they did. The University of Alberta, the Alberta government and the University of Wyoming, together in the Canadian Veterinary Journal many years ago, I think it was about 15 years ago, published an article based on research that they conducted because farmers in Alberta were saying there's something weird going on here. So the government, along with some veterinary scientists, took a look at it and said, look, there's nothing going on here. Here's the explanations as you've just described them, as Kagan and Summers described them. But that's never referenced within the pro-animal mutilation ET UFO literature, ever. And when I bring it up to people on message forums or whatever, they ignore it. I've seen that happen where these people who say, oh, cows are being mutilated, they won't even quote. I will paste JPEG pictures of the pages so that they can read them right there in the message forums. I remember this happening once in a message forum called Department 47. And there was a woman who absolutely believes cattle are being mutilated. I said, well, look, here's this article. Here are the explanations. Now, you tell me why you think that these explanations don't make sense. She just ignored it. She just totally went on and kept talking about what she wanted to talk about. She didn't even address it. I thought, well, that's great. Stick your head under the covers or be an ostrich and ignore the facts because it conflicts with the narrative that you want to believe in. Ridiculous. But that's what you get.
Well, with Chris O'Brien, the same thing. He asked me the question, so I sent him a long explanation, including the journal articles that I had found that talked about copper deficiency and how it comes about in animals and what you need to do, and never got a response. I was going to do an article on cattle mutilations in the 1970s. I think it was for Cruise, Flying Saucers, and UFO Quarterly, and they were going to do it, and they said, no, we really don't want to do cattle mutilations. And then I get a letter from them saying, we're going to publish this other article on cattle mutilations, and of course it was one that said the aliens are coming down to mutilate the cows. And the question is, why? Why would the aliens do that? Are the parts they're taking some kind of a delicacy on their planet, and they're not smart enough to take the embryos from some cows and grow their own? So they have to come down here and mutilate cows randomly on Earth. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. Every cattle mutilation I investigated, there was a rational terrestrial explanation. Every one. So I just don't see it. But as we said earlier, people will say to me, what do you think of cattle mutilations? And I said, well, I haven't looked at them for a while. So, well, you need to read this article. So I'll go read that article and see what it has to say. But nothing new is ever being published. And if you take a look at the Paranormal Fact or Fiction on the Sci-Fi Channel, the impression they give you at the end of the program is that cattle are not being mutilated by extraterrestrial entities. That all the evidence that is cited is pretty much what you'd expect from an animal as it deteriorates and decomposes over time. You're not seeing anything that is that unusual.
Right, and it's not just the extraterrestrial thing, too. We're picking on that group. But there's another, I think as that stopped making sense, and as the whole conspiracy meme really took off after 9/11, and I really think that September 11th, 2001 changed the way that people look at government and all of that. So the same people, I think, that would say, look, the American government brought down the Twin Towers, not 19 Arab hijackers, are the same people I think you started to see with animal mutilations, this idea coming forward that it wasn't aliens from Zeta Reticuli, it was our own government. And they're using the alien meme to cover up what they're doing, which is testing the cattle population for BSE, which, is a real threat to the cattle population. But they're doing it surreptitiously, and it's all part of a government scam, which would explain black helicopters and all that other stuff that seems to go along with it. What do you think of that?
Well, the question becomes, if I'm a government agent and I want to investigate these sorts of things, why don't I just buy the cattle legally on the open market? And then I'm not leaving carcasses laying around, and I'm not causing all these people to question animals, the animal mutilation. I'm not leaving a trail. I bought the animal legitimately. I've taken away to my farm or my ranch or my laboratory, and nobody knows what's happened to it, and nobody cares because it was all transacted legally. It doesn't make any sense. It just doesn't make any sense. You would think that people would see that sort of flaw in the thinking, but there's money to be made in believing cattle mutilations, and it fits into some people, as you pointed out, some people's worldview, the conspiratorial worldview, where everything is, the government is acting against the public interest, which we've seen more than once happen in the last century. But there have been a couple of cases where the animal mutilations were the result of satanic worship, but those cases are very, very few and far between. But there is some evidence for that. But that's usually teenagers kind of playing around with the idea of satanic ritual, and it's not really some kind of organized satanic cult activity going on, which was also an explanation for the animal mutilations at one point, that there was some kind of a worldwide satanic organization that was responsible for killing the cows.
This is why I never get worried about Satan, because even if he does exist, all of his followers seem to be idiots. 17-year-old pimply-faced morons in Montana that are going out and cutting up a cow for hijinks. I think the world is probably pretty safe from the Dark Lord if that's the best that he has to offer. And on that note,
well, we could probably get some other people into it as well if we really worked at it.
We could claim that Andy Devine was a UFO abductee Satanist, and publish a book about it. And you know what? I bet we'd actually make some money on that.
Well, if we're going to make money on books, we ought to make money. I ought to make some money off Crash When UFOs Fall from the Sky.
What was the name of that book again, Kevin?
That would be Crash When UFOs Fall from the Sky.
Where can people purchase this book?
You can get it at Amazon.com. It's available on your Kindle or at your local bookstore. And the reason I mentioned Kindle is because I just put a science fiction novel on Kindle called On the Second Tuesday of Next Week. It's a time travel book. So if people go to Amazon.com, they can buy Crash. They can buy On the Second Tuesday of Next Week on their Kindle. Or they can just ignore all that and spend their money on a hot dog.
I don't have any books that they can buy at Amazon yet. And my films are pretty much all available for free on the Internet, so...
Oh, I was going to say, you haven't figured out this thing where you actually charge people to watch your film then.
Well, it's the wonderful thing about, and I certainly don't want to get into a long conversation, the music industry taught the film industry a lot about how to, because everybody wants everything for free now. I've seen that repeatedly on these paranormal message boards where, you know, everybody says, well, I'm not going to pay for this guy's book, or I'm not going to pay to watch this film or whatever. We get it all for free. I'll just download it illegally. And it boggles my mind. But finally, distributors, at least in the film and television industry, have figured out, you know what? Instead of fighting that, and that is a losing battle, let's give it to them for free, but let's find other ways of monetizing it. So ad revenue. So you put it up on YouTube. Fields of Fear, for instance, which, Kevin, you're in. And Stan T. Friedman is Real, too, which you're also in. You can go to my blog, and they're both available on YouTube, courtesy of my distributor, Paranormal TV. So if you go over in the sidebar of my blog, there it is. You can see Kevin in Fields of Fear. You can see him in Stanton T. Friedman is Real for free. But because the distributor makes their money, and then I do from hits, ad revenue in some cases. So it's just a different model of distribution. And I think at some point that's probably going to be what happens with books.
That's one of the reasons I put the science fiction novel on Kindle. It's kind of an experiment to see what happened. Here's a book that I basically been working on for 17 years. And decided I'm going to throw it up on Kindle for a fairly inexpensive price and see if I can sell a few copies of it and not have to go through the hassle of dealing with editors who don't understand some of the subtleties of what you're trying to say, don't understand what's going on in the book, and ask dumb questions about it and see how that works. Because here's another way of distributing the book that I don't have to pay a lot of money to have it printed and have it bound and come up with a cover and all of the ancillary stuff, plus worry about distribution and getting into the bookstores. Here, I can put it up on Amazon and see if I can make a little bit of extra money that way. And I threw it up at a fairly inexpensive price. So it's just another way of distributing your work.
Weird. I can hear all sorts of clanky.
Oh, I was tapping on the side of the computer.
That was
without thinking about it.
All right, folks, if you're listening at home, blame Kevin Randle.
I'm now sitting on my hands.
You know what? You can blame him for the MJ-12 documents, too, because he forged them. And I know it was all Kevin, the military insider that he is.
Please, people will now believe that. There are some people who are convinced I'm a member of the MJ-12 committee because somebody once said that.
I've run into people, I kid you not, who believe I'm an undercover agent. For a number of different reasons, not the least of which is they disagree with me. But I ran into a couple of people once at the Aztec UFO conference, of all places, and they were Billy Meyer supporters, so take it with a huge grain of salt to begin with. And they also said Nick Redfern was a disinformation agent because he wears black. That was their sole rationale for why Nick is a disinformation agent. Nothing he ever said or wrote, but he always dresses in black. Clearly they missed the entire punk rock movement in the 1970s in the United Kingdom. Anyway, it was because they had read on the Internet, Carl Flock and I used to joke, publicly too, that he was MJ0 and I claimed to be MJ13, that they were expanding the membership. But somebody actually thought that was deadly serious. Crazy. And
well, some people thought I was MJ7.
MJ007.
Well, there you go, 7. And the funniest one is people were convinced, and I've seen this on the Internet as well, that I had worked with Hector Quintanilla at Project Blue Book. I was 15 years old. And then as the later parts of Blue Book, toward the end of the 60s, I was in the military, but I was in the Army, and I was in Vietnam, so I couldn't have been a member of Project Blue Book.
Were you really in Vietnam, Kevin? Because I've heard people say that you weren't really in Iraq either. I actually remember reading that thing where somebody on the Internet said, well, Kevin Randle was never in Iraq. Prove it. Well, yeah, okay, here's a picture. That's me. That's Iraq. That's me in Iraq. Which part don't you understand?
The one I have is I got a picture of me under the cross swords in downtown Baghdad.
Yes, that's the one I was thinking of.
It's kind of neat, but it's hard to tell it's me. And there's another one where I'm standing under a sign, and you can tell it's me, and it says it says Baghdad Airport, and then it says it in Arabic. So.
Yeah, and I have a picture of me in Prague outside a room that has S3 on the door, which was Cal Korf's. He was allegedly a member of S3, the secret special secret services.
Yes. Super duper secret services.
Yeah. The hotel room that I was in while staying in Prague, the room number, as soon as Holly and I got to it, she didn't really get it, but I just burst out laughing. It was S3. So here I am in Cal Korf City, his hometown, and I said to her, do you realize we're entering the secret HQ of the Israeli, Saudi, Zeta Reticulin, whatever the heck it is, super duper organization known as S3? I've got to go pick somebody up, Kevin, and so our time has kind of run out. And I've also come to the realization that I think people can only listen to about an hour on a podcast. I like to keep them short, as opposed to these 2-hour or 3-hour-long marathons. And I've been on those shows. I don't even listen to them. After an hour of listening to me talk, I kind of go, you know what? I've heard enough from this guy.
I think our problem is also going to be that this is a very negative show.
True.
We're explaining everything, not in the extraterrestrial. I think if we do it again, we can argue the merits of the Roswell case or something for an hour, and at least I can have a positive spin on what I say.
Well, you know what I'd like to do? I'd like to see a show where, whether mine or somebody else's, where somebody like you, and I know you know who he is, Lance Moody, because he often comments on your blog.
Yes.
You know, the two of you guys sort of, here it is, an hour of Ultimate Fighting Championship, polite Ultimate Fighting Championship. Let's talk Roswell, crash flying saucers, whatever, and get both sides, because I'm not even going to call Lance a skeptic. I tend to call him a disbeliever. I like Lance, don't get me wrong, but, you know, he sits on the other side of the extremist faction where nothing can possibly be real. And, you know, it would be interesting to see that kind of debate about Roswell, or anything else for that matter. And so, yeah, maybe I'll get Lance and see if he has Skype. Yeah, and he actually did, so he claims a lot of research on the Otis Carr story, too, which nobody remembers now. But I actually met Ralph Ring, who allegedly worked with Otis Carr on his flying saucer many, many years ago. He was at the 2007 Retro UFO Conference at the Integratron, another place that most people within ufology, the kids, don't really know, and they should, which was really surreal to see one of Otis Carr's guys at the Integratron talking about building a flying saucer. You had to be there. And so, you know, yeah, maybe that's something we can work out. But next time, yeah, we'll be more positive. We can talk about cases. You know what? I don't want to talk about Roswell. We can talk about leveling.
I was going to say that leveling would be a good case to talk about then.
Yeah, because everybody knows about Roswell, for good or ill. I think everybody's position on Roswell is pretty clear. So barring that new evidence I was talking about, I don't think there's much, like you're just talking about the case again. But there are a lot of cases that I don't, and Leveland is one of them. I know when I surveyed you for my best evidence film, you definitely had that on your top 10 list when you voted. The RB-47 case never gets talked about. Lance and I have been talking about the Kelly Johnson Santa Barbara sighting, but that one is largely unknown. And another one that I love, the 1976 Tehran fighter jet case, almost totally unknown outside, you know, a small group of people within UFO research. So here we have these really great cases, and they never get talked about. Why? Because people want to talk about animal mutilations or alien abductions, or you know what, whatever you think about Roswell, they want to talk about crash flying saucers too. And I'm all about just talking about good cases. So yeah, let's do that next time. We'll talk about Leveland. It's a date.
That sounds good to me.
Cool. All right, folks, Kevin Randle. I'll do my typical host thing. Kevin, where can we find out more about you and your work and your wonderful publications that people should and can buy?
Well, they can always visit my blog, which is called A Different Perspective, and if you type A Different Perspective UFO into your search engine, it's usually the first thing that pops up. It's www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com. You can find The Crash When UFOs Fall from the Sky at Amazon.com, and you can buy the book there, or you can buy it on Kindle, and then you can find the book in the bookstores nearest your house, I guess.
When I put this posting up, I'll put a link to your blog, and I'll also put a link to a specific blog post that you wrote in 2007, I think, about the Abduction Enigma, which pretty much sets out what that book was about and also what your views. Yeah, it was August 23rd, 2007. So I'll put a link up to that post in particular where it's quite a lengthy post, where you talk about the abduction phenomenon and a lot of the conclusions you and Estes and Cohn came to.
And that posting came about from some of the criticism of the book by the abduction researchers. And so I was trying to explain how we arrived at some of the conclusions we did and why we drew those conclusions based on the evidence and what it was the emphasis for that information.
The only thing I'm going to say is at that blog posting you have a picture of, I think it's Russ Estes. I've never met Estes or Cohn, but I'm pretty sure it's Russ Estes from what I've seen. And he looks like, you might want to go back and take a look at this and put a different picture of Estes up there because it makes him kind of look like a sort of Latin American dictator. He's standing there, he's laughing, he's got this maniacal look on his face. I'm just saying. There might be a better picture of Russ Estes out there. And then
I'm not sure there is. That's a good picture, Russ Estes.
Oh, okay. Because right opposite that, there's the picture of you in your military uniform, of course. I'm just thinking, what kind of junta are these two cooking up? What kind of coup were they working on?
We were going to start our own South American country.
It even looks like he has a little medal on his lapel or something. If you don't look at it too closely, it's like, yeah, Kevin Randle's been sent down to Uruguay to straighten things out. So, or Paraguay or one of the Guays. You know what? One really last quick question, because that reminds me. I swear, this is a really last quick question. The abduction phenomenon, is it solely an American thing? Do you see cases? I had written this down, and one of the things I'd said is, do we see abductions in Ghana or Bhutan or Uruguay, which is why this just clicked in? So is it a worldwide thing, or is it really more of a, say, Western or even American thing? Quick answer on that one.
It's a worldwide phenomenon. There are people all over the world who report it, but interestingly, they don't report the grays. They have other creatures that they report. And the first abduction case came out of Brazil with the Antonio Bias-Voas case from Brazil. So it's a worldwide phenomenon, but what they see, what they report are not necessarily what the Americans see and report. So it doesn't connect that way.
And they different interpretations, which might bring in a cultural component,
yes,
I would suspect.
Precisely, absolutely precise. Precisely the point. There's a cultural aspect to it that they bring in, yes.
That sounds like the perfect place to end it there, with some with a proper sort of scientific conclusion and an observation that there's something here that can explain it. So thanks, Kevin Randle, my friend, for being on the Other Side of Truth podcast. And to all my peeps, I will see you next time with another interesting guest on the Other Side of Truth.